Hi everyone. In this lecture we're going to be talking about evaluating research studies. If we remember back to some of the earlier lectures, some of the first couple of lectures of class, one of the things we talked about was really the purpose of this class. And the purpose, by way of reminder, is really to learn to appraise research, to identify high quality studies from low quality studies. Now, in some ways, that's a bit of a misnomer. You know, every study probably has strengths and weaknesses, and so I'm much more interested in your ability to identify the strengths and weaknesses of any one study, as opposed to simply just discarding a study, you know, and saying it's low quality or it's high quality. Every study is going to have strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to talk about what those are today. So because our goal in this class is really to learn to be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses, I kind of consider this week one of the more important weeks of material in this class. So the first thing to be aware of is when you look at a study is to ask yourself, is this a research study or a non-research study? You'll encounter both, and both have their uses. Research studies are always going to use data. That data might be qualitative or it might be quantitative, but if it doesn't contain any data, then it might be a non-research study, and you will encounter these. Like I said, they can be helpful sometimes. Sometimes those non-research studies are lit reviews or critiques, maybe a description of methods. If people are doing a big clinical trial, they'll often put their methods out there so that they can have something to reference, and so that people are aware of what it is they're doing. Occasionally, people will sort of outline agendas, you know, for research. They'll say this is sort of everything that's been done, and this is kind of what we need to do. Occasionally, things like editorials or letter to the editors are considered non-research. You will encounter them because they turn up in search results. I don't think they're particularly useful for our purposes, so you can probably discard those. Now, I should be clear, the thing that we're talking about here really is journal articles, the peer-reviewed literature. These standards really don't apply to books, and they certainly wouldn't apply to online materials, government websites, things that haven't been peer-reviewed. And that's really sort of one of the key points here. This lecture and the thing that sort of forms the knowledge base of social work is really the peer-reviewed literature. And so just to sort of acquaint you with what the peer review process is. So an academic writes an article. That article is then blinded. It's submitted to a journal and it's blinded. And all that means is that the author's name is taken off of it. The author's affiliations are taken off of it. And then the journal sends that article out to a couple of peer reviewers. Could be, most often it's 2, might be 3, and rarely is it 1, but it has happened before, but it's most often 2. And the author doesn't know who the reviewers are, and the reviewers don't know who the authors are. That's called a blind or a blinded peer review. And the reason they do it blinded is that that way no one's swayed by by anyone's name, either one way or the other. After reviewing it, though, the reviewers recommend typically one of 3 outcomes: accept, revise and resubmit, or reject. And that's sort of the order that they. That's sort of like the order of from good to bad. Acceptances are great; they're very rare. Revise and resubmits are, I think, the outcome that I have experienced most often. when you get a revise and resubmit, you're allowed to respond to the reviewer's comments, make some revisions, make some edits, and then submit it again for another review. Most often, those revise and resubmits then will convert to acceptances. So, as I said, acceptances are very rare. A straight-out acceptance is very rare. Revise and resubmit is a good outcome, and it usually leads to an acceptance. But rejects happen too. And actually, if I really sat down and think about it, I probably got more rejections than I have revise and resubmits. But that's just sort of the nature of the beast. After, if it's rejected from one journal, you can go and submit it to a different journal. And I mean, I've had papers where I've had to submit them to 2 and 3, 4 different journals before we've been able to find a home. That's just the way it goes sometimes. Sometimes journals publish something very similar, or it's things are outside of their wheelhouse, or they have other reasons. They just reject papers. That's, at any rate, that's what happens. But like I said, all of this is sort of to say that that what this conversation is applicable to is peer-reviewed literature, those journal articles. So all of those studies, all of the studies that you read, should have a very clear purpose. They should have a rationale, which is why the study was undertaken. They should have methods, a very clear analysis of data, and conclusion, and they'll also have references and things like that. But this is true for both qualitative and quantitative studies. So if a study doesn't have these things, you could be looking at a non-research study, or you could be looking at maybe a piece of journalism or something like that. But at any rate, if it didn't have all of these things, I would be very skeptical of whether or not it is a research study. Another way to evaluate sort of the quality of a research study is by looking at the journal itself. So the name of the journal will be mentioned on the article. You can go to the journal's website and you can check as to whether or not they are peer-reviewed. It'll say it on their website. Usually there's a chief editor, an executive editor, that kind of thing. That person should be named, and the associate editors are usually named. The journal will have usually a purpose or aims or goals, that kind of thing. They'll call it different things. A lot of journals are connected with a society or like a professional association. There's the social work research organization, for instance, is called SWR. That's the acronym right there on the screen, but it's pronounced SWR, and the acronym stands for Society for Social Work and Research. And that organization's journal is called JSWR, which is the Journal of the Society for Social Work and Research. There's a bunch of others. CSWE, which does sort of the educational credentialing of social work, has journals of its own. One is the Journal of Social Work Education, that kind of thing. But there's a bunch of others for all the different fields and subfields that are out there. Now, the journal might also have an impact factor, and you don't have to be alarmed if it doesn't. Not every journal has one. There's some controversy over sort of the utility of impact factors. If a journal does have one, that's great. That's usually a good sign. If it doesn't have one, that's okay too. It just, like I said, it means it doesn't have one. The impact factor is a ratio of published papers to citations. So what journals want are lots of citations for their published papers. And sometimes they constrict the number of papers that they're publishing in order to boost their citations and increase their impact factor. That's one of the things that makes impact factors kind of controversial sometimes, and so that's why I said it's okay if a journal doesn't have one. It just means they don't have one. So another thing to consider when you're looking at journal articles is it well written? Are the ideas presented clearly? Is there jargon? Is there wordiness? Are they using 5 or 10 cent words? And those are sort of colloquialisms. And the saying goes, don't use a 10-cent word when a 5-cent word will do. So if they're using really fancy words for sort of concepts that don't necessarily require fancy words, that's reason to be suspicious of it. But you should be able to understand journal articles the first, second, and third time you read them. If you have to read it more than 3 times, that's a good sign that maybe it's not a particularly good or well-written article. The key point of the paper should also be repeated. It should be evident in the abstract. It should be evident in the last paragraph of the discussion, and then it should be evident in the first and last paragraphs of the discussion. And as I said, this holds true for both qualitative and quantitative kinds of articles. You also should be able to detect the author's affiliation in journal articles. So most authors, or most academics, particularly in social work, are going to be affiliated with a college or university, an institution of higher education. Occasionally you'll see maybe affiliations with a hospital or an agency, maybe a VA, the Veterans Affairs Hospital. Very infrequently does it say, so-and-so, is in private practice in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or something like that. There's no reason to be alarmed if that's what you see, but you should be able to discern that this is sort of the author's kind of full-time job. It should state their degrees as well, and give a way to at least contact the corresponding author. Oftentimes that's an email address, but the corresponding author is sort of the one who handles questions and feedback from readers. So the main sections of a quantitative article, you have the title and the abstract. Keywords are going to be there. And of course, we've talked about the utility of keywords in previous lectures. But after the title, abstract, keywords, then you get into the introduction of the lit review, the methods, the results, the discussion, the references. Occasionally there's some author notes or something like that, and then, or appendices, supplemental tables, that kind of thing. But these 5 sections are 5 or 6 sections are really sort of the basic the basic sections that all quantitative articles should have. Here's where I would spend my time when I'm reading articles. If I were you, I would read the abstract very carefully. I would read the introduction or lit review also very carefully, and I would pay attention to the last paragraph of the intro or lit review. And there's a typo on the screen that should say intro, not into, intro. That last paragraph will tell you the purpose of the article. It'll tell you what it is they're hoping to accomplish. After that, you can skim the methods and results. You can skim those 2 sections. When you get to the discussion, I would start to read closely again. The first paragraph and the last paragraph of a discussion most of the time will contain good, short summaries, 1, 2, 3 sentence summaries of what the article is about. So pay especially close attention to those first and last paragraphs. Typically, the second to last paragraph is limitations. That's a useful one to pay attention to as well. In the limitations section, the authors are going to be calling attention to the weaknesses of their study. They're going to be forthright about the weaknesses, and that'll help you. That's something that's designed to help you in your appraisal of the study's strengths and weaknesses. And then, of course, you don't need to read the references, but thinking back to a couple of weeks ago in our library search lecture, you may want to review references if that's an especially helpful article, because those references will help you to identify other sources for your paper. So, quick review just of this slide again. Read the abstract very closely, read the intro or lit review very closely. Pay special attention to that last paragraph of that introduction or lit review. Skim the methods, skim the results, read the discussion very closely. Pay attention to those first and last paragraphs. They'll contain the summaries. And that second to last paragraph is going to contain the limitations. Qualitative articles, especially in social work, are likely to follow a very similar pattern as the quantitative article, the things listed on this slide. Occasionally, the lit review will come at the end, and that's especially true in grounded theory articles. You don't always encounter a grounded theory. That's a methodology. That's a way of analyzing qualitative data. But that might be the case, that the lit review just is towards the end. So don't be alarmed if you do encounter one. Regardless, all qualitative studies should contain a very clear research question and or purpose. They should be very clear about their methods, their participants, how they recruited subjects, how they interacted with them, how they developed questions. There should be a really thorough description of data analysis and what was done to establish credibility of the results. They may have checked with participants. They may have had multiple coders. Could be any number of different things, all of which we'll talk about when we get to the qualitative, the week on qualitative research. They also should very clearly state their conclusions. If they're trying to develop theory, they should have a careful description of that theory. Qualitative articles will also contain limitations and next steps. Sort of where do we go from here? A couple of other issues to consider when you're appraising studies. You should look at the age of a study. 10 to 15 years is sort of a good heuristic. There are, though, lots of exceptions. Sometimes there are just landmark studies in a field, and they just get cited for decades and decades and decades. There's a paper from 1973 that I cite all the time because the concept that one of the concepts that I'm interested in was first identified in 1973. So everyone, when they're writing about it, sort of cites this 1973 paper. So, like I said, 10 to 15 years is sort of a good heuristic. It's not a hard and fast rule, though. There are very good reasons for much older studies to be considered very high quality, and by the same token, there's very good reason for very recent studies to be considered poor quality or have some real deficiencies. Another thing to consider is sample size. So is the sample size big enough to answer the questions? Now, quantitative studies are always going to have bigger sample sizes than qualitative studies. In quantitative studies, you're typically looking for, depending on the kinds of questions, 50 to 75 to 100 or more people in a given study. If it's much fewer than that, that's something to maybe raise an eyebrow about. By the same token, it could be much more, especially if there's, they're using secondary data, like a big, one of the big government study databases or something like that. There could be actually several thousand. Qualitative studies, on the other hand, are going to have much smaller sample sizes. And again, I can't really give you a heuristic here, like a rule or a guideline to follow. But there should be some justification of the sample size in a qualitative study. And again, regardless, I can't emphasize this enough. The article should be well written. It should be clear. You should be able to detect the author's point and follow what it is they're saying. Most studies also will contain implications for practice or future research. If people are thinking about how their studies are going to impact practice or future research, that's a good indication that a study is high quality. And then, of course, you're going to want to look at the references. You want to look at the references not only because it helps you identify other papers, but you want to make sure that they're citing the seminal works in that particular area. If they haven't read some of the most important studies in the area that you're looking at, that's an indication that there might be some deficiencies in that study. So I believe that's everything. I will end it there. As always, thanks for watching.